December 6, 1941. 11:58 p.m. A Soviet soldier named Mikhail Yegorov, a 23-year-old factory welder from Tula, pressed his body flat into the frozen earth as a German artillery shell exploded 12 meters to his left. The blast threw a man named Sasha, his bunkmate, his friend of 6 years, 30 feet through the frozen air. Sasha landed without making a sound. He never moved again. Mikhail did not have time to scream. Another shell was already incoming. At that exact moment, German soldiers from the 2nd Panzer Division were standing at a tram stop in Khimki, a suburb of Moscow, close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin glittering in the winter moonlight. 6 miles. That is how close Adolf Hitler came to capturing the capital of the Soviet Union. 6 miles. Less than the distance from one end of a major city to the other. And Mikhail Yegorov, a welder, not a general, not a politician, not a hero, in any story he had ever been told, was one of the men standing between those German soldiers and that city. Here is what no history textbook tells you properly. By November 1941, more than 4 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, captured, or wounded. Army Group Center had torn through Soviet defenses like paper. Entire Soviet fronts, each one, the equivalent of an entire German army group, had been encircled, crushed, and swallowed. The Wehrmacht had captured 665,000 Soviet troops in Ukraine alone. The road to Moscow was open. The German generals could smell it. And Joseph Stalin, in the Kremlin, was making quiet arrangements to abandon his capital. What happened next would determine the fate of the entire war. And the first crack in the German advance did not come from a brilliant general's strategy. It came from desperation, brutal cold, and the simple refusal of ordinary men to die on schedule. This is the Battle of Moscow. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in the history of human warfare. 3 army groups, 3.8 million men, across a 900-kilometer front, tore into the Soviet Union simultaneously. Army Group North pushed toward Leningrad. Army Group South lunged for Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields. And Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3, drove straight toward the heart of Soviet power, Moscow. The speed was incomprehensible. In the first 4 weeks, Army Group Center advanced 400 miles. 400 miles. They captured Smolensk, a major regional city, by mid-July, placing them only 234 miles from Moscow. Soviet armies were not retreating. They were being annihilated. Entire units surrounded in pockets, the Germans called them Kessel's cauldrons, and systematically destroyed. The Red Army was collapsing faster than anyone in London, Washington, or even Berlin had predicted. But then Hitler did something that stunned his own generals. He stopped Army Group Center from advancing on Moscow. He pulled half its armored forces south to assist in the conquest of Ukraine, and sent the other half north to help capture Leningrad. His top commanders, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, General Heinz Guderian, General Hermann Hoth, protested furiously. Moscow, they argued, was the decisive objective. Take Moscow, and the entire Soviet logistical and command system collapses. Hitler called Moscow merely a mark on a map. He wanted Ukraine's resources. He wanted Leningrad's symbolic destruction. That decision cost Germany 6 weeks. 6 weeks that the Soviet Union desperately needed. When Operation Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow, finally launched on September 30, 1941. It began with terrifying success. Within barely 1 week, the Germans had encircled 4 entire Soviet armies near Vyazma, and 3 more near Bryansk. 7 armies gone. Nearly 1 million Soviet troops killed, captured, or missing. The BBC broadcast that Hitler had achieved his most successful single victory of the war. In Moscow, the Soviet government secretly began evacuating to Kuibyshev. Civilians panicked. Looting spread through the streets. Stalin declared martial law and mobilized 250,000 civilians, most of them women, to dig anti-tank ditches with their bare hands. The door to Moscow appeared to be standing wide open. And then the mud came. The Russians call it the Rasputitsa. The season when frozen ground thaws into something that is not quite earth and not quite water. A deep-sucking, bottomless mud that swallowed vehicles whole. German tanks weighing tons sank to their chassis. Horses sank to their bellies. Wheeled vehicles were simply abandoned. The only things that could move were two-wheeled wooden pony carts, peasant technology from another century. The most advanced military machine in the world was stopped cold, not by enemy fire, but by Russian dirt. Mikhail Yegorov crouched in a half-constructed trench outside Tula with a rifle he had only been handed 4 days before, did not know the strategic situation. He did not know that Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had written that the capture of Moscow would have been decisive, that all of European Russia would have been cut off from its Asiatic potential. He did not know that General Guderian was writing furious letters to Berlin, demanding winter clothing for his men. Letters that were being ignored because Hitler had promised the war would be over before winter. What Mikhail knew was this: the man next to him had frostbite in 3 fingers. The man behind him had been wearing the same summer uniform for 3 months. And the Germans, who had been unstoppable all summer, were slowing down. Not stopping, but slowing. And Mikhail, who had spent 4 years welding steel at a factory, understood something about metal under stress. There is always a point where it fractures. The German generals understood this too from the other side. By mid-November, Army Group Center had resumed its offensive after the ground finally froze solid. 3rd Panzer Army captured Klin 47 miles north of Moscow. A combat patrol from the 2nd Panzer Division reached Khimki, riding the very tram lines that Moscow civilians used for their daily commute. They could see the Kremlin spires. 6 miles. Their radio operator transmitted coordinates back to headquarters. But here is the thing about being 6 miles from Moscow in December 1941 at minus 28 degrees Celsius. The Germans had no winter uniforms. None. Hitler had assumed Barbarossa would be finished before winter arrived, so no preparations were made. German soldiers were stripping coats from Soviet corpses to survive. The oil in their tank engines was congealing. Machine guns seized in the cold and refused to fire. Artillery shells that had been stored in the open became unreliable. One German division alone reported losing more than 1,000 men to frostbite, not to enemy fire, to cold. The division's automatic weapons were entirely inoperable from sub-zero temperatures, and simultaneously something was happening on the Soviet side that the Germans could not see and could not stop. Trains. Hundreds and hundreds of trains rolling west from Siberia. Stalin had received intelligence from a spy named Richard Sorge, embedded inside the German embassy in Tokyo, that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East. That intelligence allowed Stalin to do something extraordinary: strip his Far Eastern armies and send them to Moscow. These were not the panicked conscripts the Germans had been encircling all summer. These were experienced, cold-hardened soldiers, equipped with proper winter gear, armed with the T-34 tank, whose wide tracks could maneuver through snow that swallowed German panzers. Division after division arrived, fresh, supplied, angry. On December 1st, 4th Army, the German force attacking Moscow from the west, finally joined the assault. For one brief terrifying moment, it appeared the Germans might break through. A combat group captured Yushkovo, only 23 miles from Moscow. General von Bock radioed his commanders, "The enemy is close to breaking." He was wrong about which enemy. On December 2nd, the 78th Infantry Division reached Zvenigorod, 24 miles from Moscow, and stopped. Not because orders told them to stop, because they physically could not take another step forward. The 258th Infantry Division, which had created that moment of optimism by capturing Yushkovo, was itself surrounded and forced to fight its way back westward 2 days later. General Hepner, commanding 4th Panzer Army, halted his units and ordered them onto the defensive without even requesting permission from above. He later reported that his unit's offensive strength was completely exhausted. At the Volga-Moscow Canal, the only German unit still attacking the 7th Panzer Division had crossed to a bridgehead and was being hammered by the Soviet First Shock Army, which was being reinforced continuously from Moscow's reserves. December 4th, Guderian called off 2nd Panzer Army's attack on Tula and ordered his men onto the defensive. December 5th, the attack at the canal collapsed. December 6th. At almost exactly midnight, the order for the Soviet counteroffensive went out. Mikhail Yegorov heard it first, as sound a low continuous thunder from the north and south, simultaneously building in volume, until the frozen ground itself seemed to vibrate. Then the political officer was screaming at them to get up, to move forward, that the moment had come, that the Germans were broken. Mikhail did not feel triumphant. He felt cold and terrified, and extraordinarily tired. He picked up his rifle. He stood up. He began to move east through the snow toward the German positions. In 2 months of Operation Typhoon, Army Group Center had lost 35,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. The Soviets had lost hundreds of thousands more. And yet the Germans had not taken Moscow. They had come 6 miles from its suburbs. They had seen the Kremlin spires with their own eyes. But seeing is not the same as taking. What Mikhail Yegorov did not know yet, what no one on either side fully understood in that moment, was that the German failure at Moscow was not simply a tactical setback. It was the moment the entire logic of Barbarossa collapsed. Germany had staked everything on a short war, a war of weeks, not years. Now it was December. The Soviet Union still existed, and it was about to attack. In Part 2, we will follow what happened when 1.1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by those Siberian divisions, fresh from the Far East, crashed into the exhausted German lines in temperatures of -33 degrees Celsius, and what the German High Command did when they realized that the army they had believed unbeatable was now fighting for its own survival. December 6, 1941. Mikhail Yegorov stood up from his frozen trench and walked toward the German lines. The Soviets had stopped the Wehrmacht 6 miles from the Kremlin. A welder from Tula, a factory worker nobody had ever written a story about, had survived the most desperate defensive battle in modern history. Army Group Center was exhausted. Their tanks were frozen. Their men were dying of cold faster than Soviet bullets could kill them. But stopping the Germans was not the same as destroying them. And here is the number that should terrify you on December 6, 1941. Army Group Center still had 1.9 million men on the line. Exhausted, frostbitten, undersupplied, but still armed, still organized, still dangerous. The Soviet counteroffensive that Stalin ordered that night was not a pursuit of a broken enemy. It was an attack into the teeth of a wounded predator. And the man commanding that counteroffensive, General Georgy Zhukov, knew something his political masters in the Kremlin refused to accept. His armies were not ready, Zhukov had told Stalin directly. He had sat across the desk from the most feared man in the Soviet Union and said words that could have gotten him shot. The troops are not sufficient for a full encirclement of Army Group Center. The reserves Stalin had committed to the spoiling attacks in November had been burned through. The fresh Siberian divisions were extraordinary soldiers, but they were arriving piecemeal, not as a cohesive force. Zhukov wanted to wait, to consolidate, to strike when the blow could be decisive. Stalin looked at him and said, "Attack, now." "Comrade Stalin," Zhukov replied, standing rigid, "a premature offensive with insufficient forces will not destroy the enemy. It will only push them back." "Then push them back," Stalin said. "Every kilometer between their guns and Moscow is a kilometer I can breathe." Zhukov understood the logic. He hated it, but he obeyed. The counteroffensive launched simultaneously from north and south of Moscow on the night of December 5th into the 6th. The Kalinin Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, struck from the north. The Southwestern Front hit from the south near Yelets, and Zhukov's Western Front hammered straight into the center. The Soviets committed 12 armies in the initial assault, and almost immediately they discovered the brutal truth about attacking an exhausted but experienced enemy in -30-degree cold. The Germans did not break, they bent. In the north, the Soviet 30th Army pushed hard against the 3rd Panzer Army near Klin. The Germans had been there for weeks. They knew the terrain. Their defensive positions, dug hastily into frozen earth, were not sophisticated, but they were occupied by men who understood that retreating in a Russian winter without preparation was a death sentence. The 30th Army gained ground, but it was measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers, and it cost thousands of Soviet lives per day. On the southern flank near Tula, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was in genuine crisis. The Soviet 10th Army, freshly constituted with Siberian divisions, cut into the German lines east of Tula, with a force and speed that stunned the German commanders. One regiment of the German 112th Infantry Division, already gutted by frostbite, already down to a fraction of its combat strength, simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit in 48 hours. Guderian radioed Army Group Center headquarters repeatedly. His men needed to withdraw. His men needed winter equipment. His men were dying. Zalewski, commanding Army Group Center, forwarded the requests to Brauchitsch at Army High Command. Brauchitsch forwarded them to Hitler's headquarters. Hitler's answer came back in writing: no retreat. Hold every position, not one step back. And this is where the battle transformed from a military operation into something else entirely, a collision between strategic reality and personal will, between what was physically possible and what one man in Berlin demanded of men he had never met standing in cold he had never felt. Guderian flew to see Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Brauchitsch in command. The meeting happened in a requisitioned farmhouse 20 kilometers behind the lines, heated by a single stove that barely kept the temperature above freezing. Guderian walked in wearing a captured Soviet greatcoat over his German uniform. Von Kluge looked at him with barely concealed contempt. "You are requesting permission to withdraw," von Kluge said. "I am informing you that my army will withdraw," Guderian replied, "or it will cease to exist. Those are the only two options available. The Führer has issued a direct order: no retreat. The Führer has not seen what -33 degrees does to a man in a summer uniform who has been fighting continuously for 6 months. I have. My men have." Von Kluge was silent for a long moment. Outside, the artillery rumbled continuously from both directions. "I will forward your assessment," he said finally. "But the order stands." Guderian flew back to his headquarters and ordered the withdrawal anyway. It was insubordination of the highest order. In the Wehrmacht of December 1941, it was potentially a capital offense, and he was not alone. Across Army Group Center division commanders and corps commanders were making the same calculation that an ordered withdrawal that preserved their fighting strength was worth the personal risk, because the alternative was annihilation. Hitler's response was volcanic. Over the course of 2 weeks in December, he fired Field Marshal von Brauchitsch as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and appointed himself to the position directly. He fired von Bock, commanding Army Group Center. He fired von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South. He fired Guderian. He fired Höppner. Generals who had delivered the most spectacular victories in German military history were dismissed like servants who had broken the china. And yet, the withdrawal happened anyway, because the ground itself demanded it. The Soviet counter-offensive was pushing hard on 3 sides simultaneously, and the Germans simply did not have the reserves to plug every gap. Near Klin, the 3rd Panzer Army was in danger of being cut off entirely as Soviet forces threatened to close a pincer east of the city. The withdrawal began not as a strategic decision, but as a series of tactical necessities. This unit pulling back because its flank was exposed, that unit retreating because its ammunition was exhausted, another falling back because the road behind it was about to be cut. Mikhail Yegorov was part of a rifle company advancing northwest from Tula in temperatures that made the air itself feel solid. He had never been part of an offensive before. The feeling was disorienting, moving toward the enemy rather than away from him. Seeing German vehicles abandoned in the snow, passing frozen German soldiers sitting upright against fence posts as if they had simply decided to rest and never stood up again. His company commander, a lieutenant named Voronov, who had been a schoolteacher in Saratov before the war, gathered the men before one assault on a German-held village and said something that Mikhail would remember for the rest of his life. "They are not gone," Voronov said quietly. "They are not broken. They are waiting for us to make a mistake. So we will not make one." Voronov was killed 40 minutes later by a German machine gun that had been positioned in a haystack at the edge of the village. The company took the village anyway. 23 men went in, 11 came out. By the end of December, the Soviet counteroffensive had pushed Army Group Center back between 50 and 200 kilometers across the front, a massive achievement, a reversal that no German strategic plan had accounted for. The Wehrmacht had never retreated this far from anything. The psychological impact in Berlin was severe. The myth of German invincibility, carefully constructed through 2 years of uninterrupted conquest, had cracked open in the Russian winter. But Zhukov had been right about something Stalin had refused to hear. The Soviet armies did not have the strength to destroy Army Group Center. The encirclements that Stalin demanded, the grand pincer movements that would trap and annihilate entire German army groups, as the Germans had done to the Soviets all summer, never materialized. The Soviet spearheads that pushed deepest into German territory became isolated themselves. Several Soviet divisions operating behind German lines were cut off and had to be supplied by air. Some were never extracted. The Germans were bleeding. They were retreating. They were humiliated and shaken and desperately short of everything. But they were not destroyed. And in January 1942, as the temperature dropped to -40 in some sectors, as both sides were reduced to men in rags, clawing at frozen ground for any advantage, a German colonel named Walter Model took command of the 9th Army on Army Group Center's northern flank. Model was not famous yet. He was not a household name. He was a compact, aggressive, ferociously competent man who believed that defense was not passive, but active, that a line did not hold by sitting behind it, but by attacking constantly into the enemy's weak points. Model looked at his crumbling front and did not see disaster. He saw opportunity. In Part 3, we will follow what happened when Model turned the Wehrmacht's desperate retreat into something the Soviet High Command had never encountered and had no answer for, and how that transformation in the killing cold of a Russian winter set the conditions for the most catastrophic single defeat in Soviet military history. Mikhail Yegorov had survived the German advance to within 6 miles of Moscow. He had stood up from a frozen trench on December 6th and walked forward into the counteroffensive. And now, in January 1942, the Soviets were pushing Army Group Center back across the frozen Russian landscape. The Germans were retreating. For the first time in the entire war, the Wehrmacht was moving west instead of east. But a wounded predator is the most dangerous kind. Here is the number in January 1942. German Army Group Center still held a continuous front of over 1,000 kilometers. The Soviets had pushed them back 50 to 200 kilometers in some sectors. But in others, the German line had not moved at all. And in those sectors, a transformation was happening that Soviet intelligence was only beginning to understand, and what they were seeing should have terrified them. The Germans were learning to fight the Russian winter instead of dying in it. German military intelligence. The Abwehr began filing urgent reports in early January about Soviet offensive patterns. The reports landed on the desk of Colonel Walter Model, the new commander of the 9th Army, and they confirmed what he had already observed from the front lines. The Soviet counteroffensive was powerful, but predictable. It followed roads. It concentrated at obvious crossing points. It attacked where maps suggested weakness, rather than where actual weakness existed. The Siberian divisions were superb fighters individually and at the small unit level. But Soviet operational planning at the army and front level was still rigid and formulaic, a legacy of Stalin's purges of experienced officers in 1937 and 1938 that had gutted the Red Army's intellectual capacity at the highest levels. Model saw the pattern. He called his corps commanders together in the second week of January in a schoolhouse near Rzhev that served as 9th Army headquarters. The windows were stuffed with rags against the cold. The maps on the walls showed a front line that looked frankly catastrophic. Soviet penetrations had created a series of bulges and salients that conventional military thinking would have required immediate withdrawal to straighten. Model looked at those bulges and saw something else entirely. "We do not retreat from these penetrations," he told his commanders. "We allow them, and then we cut them off." The room was silent. One general, whose name history does not record, said what everyone was thinking: "That is insane. We don't have the strength to encircle anyone." "We don't need strength," Model said. "We need speed. The Soviets push forward faster than their supply lines can follow. Every kilometer they advance, they become weaker. We let them advance. Then we close the base." It was a reversal of everything German doctrine had said about defensive warfare. It was in the language of the Eastern Front, in January 1942, a genuinely radical idea. And Model did not ask Berlin for permission. He implemented it immediately. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence was reporting something alarming to Zhukov's headquarters. German resistance in certain sectors was not weakening as the counteroffensive gained momentum. It was stiffening. Specifically around Rzhev, a mid-sized city on the upper Volga that Model's Ninth Army held Soviet attacks that had been gaining 2 to 3 kilometers per day in December were now gaining 2 to 300 meters. Sometimes nothing at all. And Soviet casualties were climbing. In the first 3 weeks of January 1942, the Soviet 29th and 39th Armies pushed deep into German-held territory north of Rzhev, advancing nearly 80 kilometers past the German front line. On maps in Moscow, it looked like a triumph. Zhukov ordered them to continue driving west to cut off the Ninth Army from the rest of Army Group Center to create the decisive encirclement that would destroy Model's force entirely. What the maps did not show was that those two Soviet armies were now connected to the rest of the Western Front by a corridor barely 15 kilometers wide, and Model had noticed. January 22, 1942. The temperature was minus 28 degrees Celsius. The snow was chest-deep in the open fields north of Rzhev. Model ordered the attack at 0400 hours. 2 German divisions, the 1st Panzer Division and the 36th Motorized Division, struck simultaneously from north and south into the base of the Soviet corridor. They were not at full strength. No German unit on the Eastern Front was at full strength in January 1942. The 1st Panzer had perhaps 60 operational tanks out of its authorized complement of over 200. The 36th Motorized moved on foot because its vehicles had frozen solid the previous week. But they moved fast. And they moved with the ferocity of men who understood that stopping was death. The Soviet defenders at the corridor base were the 369th Rifle Division, a unit that had been fighting continuously since October and was down to roughly 40% of its original manpower. They were dug into the snow facing west where German attacks were expected. The German attack came from the northeast and southeast simultaneously. Guns firing, engines screaming, men running through snow that swallowed their legs to the knee. The 369th broke within 4 hours. Not because it lacked courage, because it was caught from 2 directions at once by an enemy it had been told was retreating, and because the temperature that morning was cold enough to jam Soviet automatic weapons. By noon on January 22nd, the corridor was closed. The Soviet 29th and 39th Armies, approximately 60,000 men with their artillery, their supply trains, their medical units were encircled, cut off, surrounded deep inside German-held territory. Mikhail Yegorov was not in that pocket. His regiment had been fighting 30 kilometers south near the town of Sychevka in a grinding assault against German infantry positions that had not moved in 3 weeks. When word came through the field telephone that 2 Soviet armies had been encircled behind the lines, his company commander, a new Lieutenant Voronov, was 3 weeks dead, read the message twice, and said nothing. What do you say when the army you believed was winning suddenly has 60,000 men trapped behind enemy lines? The encircled Soviet forces fought desperately to break out. Stalin ordered relief attacks from outside the pocket. Those attacks went in for 6 weeks repeatedly and failed repeatedly. Model held the encirclement with the same principle he had used to create it. Speed over mass counterattack instead of passive defense. Never allow the enemy to consolidate at any point along the perimeter. Inside the pocket, the 29th Army began to disintegrate. Ammunition ran out first, then food. Soviet aircraft flew supply missions into improvised airstrips cut into the snow, but the quantities they could deliver were a fraction of what 60,000 men needed. By late February, soldiers in the pocket were eating their horses, then the leather from their harnesses. The 29th Army's commander, General Maslenikov, was evacuated by aircraft in early March. When it became clear the pocket would not be relieved, 30,000 Soviet soldiers were left behind. Most of them died. The Battle of the Rzhev Pocket. One of dozens of desperate engagements that history has largely forgotten because it fits no comfortable narrative of inevitable Soviet victory, demonstrated something that would define the Eastern Front for the next 18 months. The Germans had lost the initiative strategically. They could not take Moscow. They could not win the war in the East by offensive action alone. But tactically, at the level of divisions and corps and armies, they remained brutally effective. They could still kill Soviet soldiers faster than Soviet soldiers could kill them, and this meant the war would last longer than anyone in Moscow or Berlin or Washington wanted to admit. Soviet losses in the winter counteroffensive of 1941 to 1942 totaled over 600,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. German losses were severe, approximately 265,000 for the same period. But the Red Army, for all its sacrifice, had not achieved the decisive victory Stalin had demanded. Army Group Center still existed. It still held a continuous front. It had been pushed back, bloodied and shaken, but it had not been broken. Zhukov knew what this meant. He said it to Stalin in February 1942, in language that was as direct as a man could be when speaking to someone who had shot generals for delivering bad news. "We have done what was possible. We have not done what was necessary." Stalin looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded slowly and said, "Then we will try again in summer." Mikhail Yegorov was pulled out of the line in March 1942 with what remained of his regiment, 41 men out of the 312 who had started the winter counteroffensive. He had frostbite in 2 toes on his left foot. The doctors discussed amputation. He argued with them for 2 days and eventually kept both toes, though they never felt normal again. He sat in a field hospital cot and tried to understand what had happened over the past 9 months. He had been a welder. He had made pipes and fittings and structural supports for factories. He had known nothing about war except what movies had shown him, which he now understood was nothing at all. He had seen men die from cold, and from bullets, and from simple exhaustion. He had seen an entire Soviet army disappear into German encirclement. He had walked forward in the dark on the night of December 6th, not knowing if the man to his left would still be alive in an hour, and Moscow was still standing. That Mikhail decided was enough. It had to be enough, because the war was not over. Everyone knew it was not over. The Germans still occupied vast territories. Leningrad was still encircled, its population dying of starvation. The summer campaign of 1942 was coming, and no one who had survived the winter had any illusions about what summer would bring. But Moscow was standing, and the myth of German invincibility was not. Somewhere in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was firing generals and promoting others and planning his next offensive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, certain despite all evidence that one more push would break Soviet resistance permanently. And somewhere in the Kremlin, Stalin was reading production reports from factories east of the Ural Mountains, factories that had been evacuated piece by piece from Western Russia ahead of the German advance factories that were now producing T-34 tanks and Katyusha rockets and artillery shells in numbers that would have seemed impossible a year before. The Battle of Moscow was over. What it had decided and what it had left undecided would take 3 more years and tens of millions of lives to resolve. In Part 4, we will follow what happened to the men and decisions of Moscow, why this battle, forgotten in the West and complicated in Russian memory, may be the single most consequential event of the entire war, and what Mikhail Yegorov, former welder from Tula, found when the fighting finally stopped. Mikhail Yegorov, a welder from Tula, had walked forward into the dark on December 6, 1941, with a rifle he had owned for 4 days. He had survived the German advance to 6 miles from the Kremlin. He had fought through the Soviet counteroffensive that pushed Army Group Center back across the frozen steppe. He had watched 271 men from his regiment disappear to bullets, to cold, to exhaustion, and emerged in March 1942 with frostbitten toes and the particular silence of someone who has seen too much to speak easily about any of it. But what happened to him after the gun stopped is the part of this story that almost no one tells, and it contains a twist that changes how you understand everything that came before. Mikhail was discharged from the Red Army in October 1944. Not killed. Not decorated with a Hero of the Soviet Union medal. Not promoted into the officer corps the way the inspiring version of this story would require. He was discharged because the frostbite that he had argued the doctors out of treating properly in March 1942 had spent 2.5 more years getting worse, and by the autumn of 1944 he had lost 2 toes on his left foot and was walking with a permanent limp that made him a liability in the line. I went home to Tula on a train that took 6 days because the rail lines were still being repaired from German damage. He arrived at his apartment building to find that the building had been partially destroyed by German artillery in November 1941, the same artillery whose shells he had been dodging in the trenches outside the city. His mother was living with neighbors 2 streets over. She was alive. She had survived by working at the very weapons factory where Mikhail had once welded pipes, manufacturing rifles and artillery shells for the Red Army. They sat together in the neighbor's kitchen and drank tea and did not speak for almost an hour. There was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. Mikhail went back to work at the factory in 1945 when the war ended. Not as a celebrated veteran, not as a symbol of Soviet resistance, but as a welder. The same job, the same tools, the same shift hours. The Soviet system was not sentimental about ordinary soldiers. The heroes of the Battle of Moscow in official Soviet history were generals Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev. The political narrative required commanding figures, not factory workers from Tula with frostbitten feet. He worked at the factory until 1971. He never wrote a memoir. He gave one interview in 1965 to a local Tula newspaper for the 24th anniversary of the German retreat from Moscow. The journalist asked him what he remembered most clearly about the battle. Mikhail thought for a moment and said, "The cold, and Sasha. The explosion that took Sasha. Everything else runs together after a while. But those 2 things are still perfectly clear." The newspaper printed the interview on page 7. Mikhail Yegorov died in 1979, 34 years after the war ended in the same city where he had been born, doing largely the same work he had always done. He was 61 years old, unremarkable by every official measure. Undecorated beyond the standard campaign medals every surviving soldier received. His name appears in no major historical account of the Battle of Moscow, and yet, he was there. He was at the exact location where the tide of the entire war turned. He was one of the men whose collective refusal to die, not heroic in any cinematic sense, just stubbornly biological, made everything else possible. The legacy of what happened at Moscow does not belong to any single man. That is precisely what makes it significant. The Battle of Moscow established patterns that defined the entire subsequent course of the war and left marks that military historians are still analyzing today. The Soviet defensive system that held Moscow in late 1941, the interlocking network of anti-tank ditches, artillery positions, infantry, strong points, and mobile reserve units, became the template for every major Soviet defensive operation that followed. At Kursk, in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the Soviets did not simply wait for the German attack. They built a defensive system nearly 300 kilometers deep with over 1 million anti-tank mines and 20,000 artillery pieces based on lessons learned at Moscow 18 months earlier. The Germans lost 700 tanks in 3 days and never launched another major strategic offensive in the east. The T-34 tank, whose wide tracks had allowed Soviet armor to maneuver in the Moscow mud, while German panzers sank to their hulls, became the most produced tank in history, over 84,000 units manufactured before the war ended. The principle it demonstrated at Moscow, that mechanical reliability in extreme conditions mattered more than raw firepower or armor thickness, influenced tank design in every major military for decades. The American M1 Abrams, the German Leopard 2, the British Challenger. All of them incorporate design philosophies about winter operations and mechanical robustness that trace their conceptual lineage to the lessons of Moscow, 1941. The Katyusha multiple rocket launcher, which had made its first significant battlefield appearance against German forces during Operation Typhoon, went from a curiosity to a cornerstone of Soviet artillery doctrine. By 1945, the Red Army was firing over 10,000 Katyusha rockets per major offensive. The system was studied, copied, and adapted by virtually every military on Earth. Modern multiple-launch rocket systems. The American MLRS, the Russian BM-30 Smerch, the Israeli Lynx are all direct descendants of the weapon that first howled across frozen Russian fields in October 1941, terrifying German soldiers who had never heard anything like it. But the deepest legacy of Moscow is not technological. It is psychological and strategic, and it operates at a level that is easy to miss if you focus only on the numbers. Before Moscow, the Wehrmacht had never been stopped. From Poland in 1939, through France in 1940, through Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941, German military power had moved in one direction forward. The speed and decisiveness of German operations had created a belief in Berlin, in London, in Washington, and critically inside the German officer corps itself, that German military superiority was essentially absolute. That belief was a weapon as powerful as any tank or artillery piece, because it caused enemies to collapse before contact and encouraged German commanders to take risks that a more sober assessment of their actual resources would have prevented. Moscow shattered that belief. Not completely, not instantly, but permanently. After December 1941, German generals, who had once accepted extraordinary operational risks based on the assumption of certain victory, began to calculate differently. The confidence that had driven Army Group Center 400 miles in 4 weeks was replaced gradually by a more cautious and ultimately more brittle mentality. German commanders who survived Moscow spent the rest of the war knowing, in the part of themselves that military doctrine cannot reach, that they could lose. This matters because wars are not won only by weapons and numbers. They are won by the accumulation of decisions made by individuals under conditions of fear and uncertainty, and the Battle of Moscow changed the conditions under which every subsequent German decision was made. There is one detail about the Battle of Moscow that most histories mention briefly, if at all, and that deserves to be stated plainly here because it changes the moral weight of everything else. The Soviet Union lost approximately 926,000 men, killed or missing in the defensive phase of the Battle of Moscow from October through December 1941. In the counteroffensive phase from December 1941 through April 1942, the Soviets lost a further 620,000 killed or missing. That is nearly 1.5 million men dead in 6 months in a single theater of a single war. For comparison, the United States lost approximately 405,000 men, killed across the entire Second World War in all theaters over 4 years. The scale of Soviet sacrifice at Moscow is almost impossible to process as a human fact. The numbers become abstract. They stop feeling like people and start feeling like statistics. But Mikhail Yegorov was not a statistic. He was a welder who liked tea and remembered his friend Sasha perfectly, clearly, 30 years later, while everything else had run together. Multiply him by 1.5 million, and you begin to approach the actual cost of what happened in the winter of 1941 to 1942 outside Moscow. The twist, the detail that almost no account of this battle includes, is this. In 2002, Russian archivists declassifying Soviet-era documents discovered a set of field reports from the Tula Defensive District dated November and December 1941. Among them was a report from a factory workers' militia unit that had participated in the defense of Tula's northern perimeter in late November, the period when Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army had Tula surrounded on 3 sides and was pressing toward the Tula-Moscow highway. The report listed the unit's composition and noted in bureaucratic Soviet language, entirely devoid of drama, that the unit included workers from the local armaments factory, including welding specialists redeployed to infantry function due to manpower emergency. One of the names on that list is M.I. Yegorov. Mikhail Yegorov had told the 1965 newspaper journalist that he had been sent to the front with a rifle 4 days after receiving it. What the declassified documents revealed was that before he was sent to the front as a rifle infantryman, he had spent 3 weeks in November 1941 as part of a factory militia unit defending the northern approaches to Tula, using welding equipment to construct improvised anti-tank obstacles along roads where German panzers were expected to advance. He had quite literally used the skills of his ordinary working life to help stop the most powerful armored force in the history of warfare. He never mentioned this in the 1965 interview. Perhaps he did not think it was remarkable. Perhaps to a man who had spent 40 years welding steel using a welding torch was simply what you did when someone handed you a problem that needed welding. The fact that the problem happened to be German tanks on the road to Moscow did not change the basic nature of the work, from a welder's workshop in Tula to the frozen trenches outside Moscow. From 6 miles to the Kremlin spires gleaming in winter moonlight, to the moment the German advance stopped and reversed. From 1.5 million dead, whose names no monument can hold to the one name, Sasha, that Mikhail Yegorov could still see perfectly clearly 30 years later. The Battle of Moscow was decided by generals making strategic calculations, by politicians making desperate choices, by the brutal mathematics of industrial production and military logistics. But it was also decided by men like Mikhail Yegorov, who picked up a rifle they had owned for 4 days, stood up from a frozen trench in -28-degree cold, and walked forward anyway. Not because they were heroes in any story they had ever been told, but because the alternative was unacceptable, and because Moscow was behind them, and because Sasha was already gone and someone had to keep moving. If you know a story like this, a name history, forgot a moment that changed everything without anyone writing it down properly, share it in the comments. These are the stories that matter most, and most of them are still waiting to be told. The most important battles in history were not won by the men whose names are on the monuments. They were won by the men who built the monuments' foundations with their hands and then went quietly home.